The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. For 13 tense days, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a standoff that threatened global annihilation. It was a moment in history when the fate of humanity rested on the decisions of a few leaders, as both sides prepared for a potential nuclear exchange. How did this crisis begin? Why did the Soviets place nuclear missiles in Cuba? And how was disaster ultimately avoided? This is the deep history of the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of the most critical events of the Cold War. The roots of the crisis lay in the Cold War struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. By the early 1960s, both superpowers had developed extensive nuclear arsenals, and tensions were already high. The United States had placed nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, within striking distance of Soviet territory. Meanwhile, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, an unsuccessful U.S.-backed attempt to overthrow Cuban leader Fidel Castro, pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union. Seeing an opportunity to shift the strategic balance, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev secretly deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba. His goal was to defend Castro's government, counterbalance U.S. missile deployments in Europe, and demonstrate Soviet strength. Missile deployments in Europe, and demonstrate Soviet strength. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba captured photographic evidence of Soviet missile installations under construction. The revelation was a shock to the U.S. government. Nuclear missiles capable of striking major American cities were being placed just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. When President John F. Kennedy was briefed 2 days later, he faced an immediate crisis. Should the U.S. launch an attack on Cuba? Should they blockade the island? Or should they attempt diplomatic negotiations? The decision would determine whether the world plunged into nuclear war. For 13 days, from October 16th to October 28, 1962, the world held its breath. On October 22nd, Kennedy addressed the nation, announcing a quarantine naval blockade of Cuba to prevent further Soviet missile shipments. The crisis escalated rapidly as Soviet ships carrying nuclear warheads approached the U.S. blockade. On October 24th, the world came dangerously close to war as U.S. warships and Soviet vessels stared each other down in the Atlantic. Military forces on both sides were put on high alert, and nuclear bombers were placed on standby. Behind the scenes, secret diplomatic exchanges intensified. On October 26th, Khrushchev sent a private letter to Kennedy, offering to remove the missiles from Cuba if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. However, on October 27th, a second, more aggressive letter arrived, demanding that the U.S. also remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey. That same day, a U.S. U-2 reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba, further escalating tensions. Many within the U.S. military pressed for immediate retaliation, but Kennedy hesitated. Any miscalculation could spark nuclear war. The crisis was finally resolved through a secret diplomatic agreement. Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, met covertly with Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin to negotiate a way out. They reached a deal. The Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. would publicly guarantee not to invade Cuba. Additionally, in a private and undisclosed agreement, the U.S. would remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey 6 months later. This secret concession was crucial in persuading Khrushchev to stand down without appearing weak. On October 28, 1962, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would dismantle its missile installations in Cuba. In return, the U.S. lifted its blockade and later removed its missiles from Turkey. The world stepped back from the brink of nuclear war. However, the crisis left both sides shaken and aware of the catastrophic consequences of nuclear escalation. The Cuban Missile Crisis had profound consequences for the Cold War. A direct hotline between Washington and Moscow was established to prevent future misunderstandings. In 1963, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed, limiting nuclear weapons testing. The crisis also damaged Khrushchev's credibility within the Soviet Union, contributing to his downfall in 1964. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains one of history's greatest lessons in diplomacy, brinkmanship, and the fragile balance of nuclear deterrence. It proved that rational diplomacy, not war, was the key to survival. It also showed how a single miscalculation could have led to the destruction of civilization. Even today, as nuclear tensions persist in various parts of the world, the lessons of October 1962 remain as relevant as ever. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the moment when the world truly stood on the edge and, against all odds, stepped back.